Next up, we have Professor Aneil Malhotra. Can we improve the ECG criteria? Aneil, the floor's yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And I would like to talk about, can we improve the ECG criteria in athletes? In 2010, the ESC proposed Group 1 training-related changes that were deemed within the realms of physiological adaptation, and also Group 2 training-unrelated changes that warranted further evaluation. But what we found was that there was an unacceptably high false positive rate of up to 32% in white athletes, represented by the grey figure, and up to 40% of black athletes, represented by the black figure. And along came the Seattle criteria that actually accounted for ethnic variation and also highlighted some abnormal findings such as left axis deviation, atrial enlargement, and RVH as abnormal findings, and successfully reduced the false positive rates to up to 9% amongst white and 18% amongst black athletes respectively. But a year later, the refined criteria actually highlighted borderline variance and put left atrial enlargement, right atrial enlargement, axis deviation, and right ventricular hypertrophy in an orange or yellow box defined as borderline criteria. And if one was present in isolation, that would be deemed normal. And this successfully reduced the false positive rates even further to up to 5% in white and 12% in black athletes. So that's the evolution of the ECG criteria. Our own UK-based experience of teenage footballers showed a similar reduction in false positive rates as older adult athletes, according to the 3 criteria. However, nearly 1 in 25 young athletes and 1 in 15 adult athletes still required unnecessary investigations, further work, and anxiety. So this culminated in the international criteria in 2017, which, rather like Hovis bread, combine the best of both. So you've got the borderline changes in keeping with the refined criteria in the yellow box in the middle, as well as a more pragmatic approach to anterior T-wave inversion, accounting for the juvenile pattern and V1 to V2 being deemed normal in white athletes. And the results showed an even further reduction in the false positive rates to as low as 1.7% and 3.6% respectively in white and black athletes. And the overall false positive rate was 2%, which is deemed acceptable and far lower than any other national screening program, be it bowel or breast cancer here in the UK. So currently, the 2017 criteria do demonstrate excellent diagnostic accuracy with a sensitivity of up to 95% and high specificity as well. However, if we are going to try to pick holes in these criteria, we have to acknowledge that limitations do exist. And that includes phenotype negative disease, which remains difficult to detect with the ECG alone sometimes. And the validation studies I've touched on have predominantly focused on male European athletes, which leaves critical gaps in our understanding of other groups, including female athletes, para-athletes, and Asian athletes who are emerging as a fastest growing athlete group. And what about the significance of these borderline changes in the middle? So grey zones still do exist, for example, inferior T-wave inversion amongst others. And this poses 2 questions. Are the international criteria therefore truly representative of a global athletic population? And what can we do to improve this further? Now, we've already heard that a normal ECG doesn't always equate to a normal heart, with up to 10% of athletes with a cardiomyopathy going undetected, be it due to quiescent cardiomyopathy, early stage disease, or life-threatening structural disease. In fact, just 2 days ago, I was in clinic assessing a 20-year-old athlete with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and a septum of 19 millimeters who was gene positive. And even the outdated computer deemed this normal. And importantly, when compared to his previous ECG 2 years ago, there were no significant changes found. So we do have to be aware that we could get caught out. Our own experience demonstrated that among over 11,000 athletes that Michael has alluded to already, 2 who died did demonstrate an abnormal ECG and echocardiogram, but that did still leave 6 with normal ECGs and echocardiograms at the time of screening, which highlights the importance of longitudinal surveillance and also the potential limitations of the screening tools that we have. And what about the diagnostic ambiguity of these borderline ECG changes in the middle? Well, a study led by my PhD student Ken Yamagata has taken over 17,000 footballers here in the UK who were all assessed with an ECG and echocardiogram between 2017 and 2024, around the age of 18. 70% were white and 15% were female. And they all underwent a HQ, ECG, and echocardiogram. And what we found was right atrial enlargement was by far the most prevalent borderline finding amongst both male and female footballers, followed by left atrial enlargement, left axis deviation, right axis deviation, and then a small proportion showing right bundle branch block. 2 cases of sudden cardiac death associated with conditions were identified in athletes with isolated left atrial enlargement, and they were coronary artery anomalies and severe aortic root dilatation requiring surgical intervention. So in fact, the left atrial enlargement was likely an incidental finding, and out of those borderline changes did demonstrate the highest sensitivity, albeit very low at 3.3%, and all the other isolated borderline changes had 0 sensitivity. So although LAE in isolation had a high specificity, it had a very low positive predictive value. So the ability of these borderline changes to detect serious conditions remained uniformly poor, highlighting the complexity of risk stratification in athletic populations. And there are a number of other populations, for example, the anterior T-wave inversion conundrum in Black athletes, Asian athletes demonstrating more anterior repolarization changes, female athletes that have lower QRS amplitudes, and para-athletes who have a variety of different cardiovascular needs. And understanding such differences are critical to assess these athletes in terms of population-specific ranges and the diversity from which they participate. So there are evidence gaps that require further investigation, including the significance of inferior T-wave inversion. What about the male athlete repolarization variant, which Rim and his American colleagues have recently reported as a normal finding, irrespective of race in V1 to V4? Our anterior T-wave inversion conundrum still exists amongst female athletes. Another conundrum exists, including... Right. Will it appear back on my screen? I can go off this one. Low QRS voltages, as I've alluded to before, and even demonstrating some PVCs may be higher risk than others, as Alessandro Zorzi has demonstrated with certain inferior or non-inferior axis and short coupling features. So coming back to the current international criteria of 2017, the borderline changes do require revision in line with the contemporary data, and the new international criteria in 2025 that we are working towards, and this is only a draft iteration of this, are being reviewed, and many of you may well have attended the summit recently in Seattle, and the areas of contention that I've talked about are highlighted in the yellow box, which have now been substituted with these female athlete conundrums in V1 to V3, inferior T-wave inversion, low QRS complexes, and PVCs, along with axis deviation. The male athlete repolarization variant in J-point elevation and convex ST elevation, followed it by T-wave inversion confined to V1 to V4, is now accepted as a normal variant with some pathological features, for example, the PVC with a non-inferior axis being highlighted in the further evaluation box. So to summarize, the 2017 international criteria have been a major advance in sports cardiology over the last 2 decades with excellent specificity and a high sensitivity. There have been persistent grey zones, including the borderline findings, false negative phenotype, negative disease, and inferior and anterior T-wave inversion question marks. And also, refinements required through data and nuance, with future improvements needing diverse international registries, longitudinal assessment protocols, population-specific thresholds, and enhanced education and interpretation by clinicians. And our goal is precision, not replacement, because perfection is the enemy of progress. And our objective is to continually improve ECG interpretation and not reinvent the wheel. And this journey is towards a consensus with the revised update of the international criteria due soon, so it'll be interesting to validate those as well. And the overarching aim is to ensure that every athlete, regardless of sex, ethnicity, or ability, is screened fairly, accurately, and safely. Thank you very much for your attention.